Welcome to the Communication and Cultural Policy Conference, the session on algorithmic digital culture and algorithmic governance. We have some exciting presentations lined up today. And our first presenter is Alex Mayhew, who's a PhD candidate at Western, working with Grant Campbell. His project is creating a new cataloging paradigm that he calls Philometrics, which would Philometrics catalog allow users to create links between catalog records and add meaningful connections. So I'll let Alex talk more about that project and their presentation today, the social selection of algorithms.
Hello, my name is Alex Mayhew, and this is my presentation on an idea that I call social selection of algorithms. All right, so just give you an introduction. This idea is based off of an idea that was generated during a research project with Janica Polak-Potts, in which I was a volunteer interviewee. So I want to thank her and the research team for giving me this opportunity to engage with this topic. The place I ended up is a speculation based off an analogy, built on an abstraction, built on a brand new field of technology. So some skepticism of where I end up is a bit warranted. Also, I want to thank those researchers, but anything that is amiss in this idea is not their fault. All right, so here's the 30-second version. I want to make the case that explainable AI, XAI systems, explain the decisions or reasonings of post-AI systems. There's a great deal of interest in their potential. There will likely be one day many XAI systems, and there'll be so many that it'll form something like an ecosystem. And like biological ecosystems, there will be evolutionary pressures put on various entities within the ecosystem. In particular, the next generation of XAI systems will be selectively based off of existing XAI systems. Users will select for explanations they personally find credible, which often means how well the explanation coheres to our existing beliefs about the world. And that sort of feedback will be part of what algorithms get selected as the basis of the next generation. And thus, through no fault of our own, with no malicious people in the situation, there could be, but that doesn't need to be, and that's my point, we will be training our XAI systems to generate explanations that diverge from our best understanding of the actual events. In other words, we are training our XAI systems to deceive us to one degree or another. So let's go through this whole thing. So as I say, the place I end up is a speculation built on an analogy, built on an abstraction, built on a brand new field of technology. So let's start with that. Explainable AI is, well, a type of AI itself. And AI is generally thought of these days as a black box. How it achieves its results are not fully understood. They use machine learning and neural nets, and you can look inside, but it's usually beyond human comprehension. Explainable AIs are special dedicated black boxes that are supposed to look inside other ones and tell you what's going on. Sometimes they look inside themselves too. Whether or not they're one machine or two machines is not really relevant for my purposes. So this is what is supposed to be the case with XAI systems. We have today, with this delightful chart from DARPA, we have our training data, our machine learning process, a learn function, and it produces this decision or recommendation. And we don't know why it does that. In comes the XAI system that tells us why that decision or recommendation was reached. And now everyone's happy, and we can all thank DARPA. Let's use another example here. We have an AI system for bank loans. Do you get your loan? Yes or no? Right now, user's neutral, waiting to find out. User gets his loan, he's happy, no problem. But what happens when the user doesn't get their loan? Okay, the user would plausibly want an explanation for why their loan request was denied. Fair enough. What happens right now? So if you're lucky, a human can review your case and reach a different decision, maybe. Or a human programmer might be able to look inside the bank loan AI and figure out what happened. Maybe. There's usually, again, beyond human comprehensibility, but maybe. And there might be other options as well. But these options always cost time and money that the AI system was supposed to save in the first place. So what do we do? Well, XAI is the offered solution. So the user got their no decision, but the XAI system comes along and provides an explanation what goes on. And the user isn't thrilled, but they're mollified. They're better off than they were. Okay. So let's move on to the abstraction. Contemplating how the AI, XAI user interaction works is important. So that chunk is very important, but it's not the only level of abstraction that challenges might emerge in. The key notion here is that there are likely going to be more than one XAI systems, likely a great many. You can imagine companies whose whole business model is providing XAI systems, different generations, different versions, what have you. Okay, so now we have an XAI ecosystem. But why will there be many? Well, multiple organizations provide XAI as a service, different versions will overlap in time. And for development purposes, it's really useful to deploy multiple different versions. The Google algorithm does this all the time. So we have reason to suspect there will be many. Okay. Let's describe this XAI ecosystem a little bit more. So there'll be multiple XAI systems operating in the same conceptual space. The next generation of XAI system could well inherit some aspects of the current version, like programming architecture or training data, maybe even the neural net itself, but more likely just the parameters that are going into it. Only some of the XAI systems will be selected to serve as the template for the next generation. The actual situation is very complicated, but that's, I think, a reasonable simplification. And so the XAI system, the different versions that exist at the same time, do sit in something of competition with one another to pass on their architecture or their inheritable characteristics to the next generation. So let's build that analogy then. In an XAI ecosystem, we have the makings of an analogy to biological evolution. Various species of XAI compete with each other to pass on their genes. But what exactly is being selected for? What's causing us to choose one over the other to build the next system based on? Well, there are many selection pressures on the XAI systems. There's the development cost, setup cost, the energy cost, speed of the system, but also, importantly, user reactions, how the user gives feedback, what type of feedback the user gives about their experience with the system. And user reactions can take many forms. After experience surveys, complaints sent to higher up people, voice stress or facial expression monitoring, which is frightening, but yeah, that's probably coming. And this does raise the question, what sort of explanations do users prefer? And this is where I suggest, by looking at some of cognitive research, cognitive science research, that humans typically prefer coherence over truth. This means that XAI end users' judgment of explanation quality is not necessarily based on the reality of how the original decision was made, but is instead based on how convincing the explanation is. This suggests that explanations that are consistent with user expectations and free of noticeable contradictions are more likely to be accepted, even if that explanation is not an accurate fit to reality. Truth is stranger in fiction. Fiction, after all, has to make sense, so say the writers. So let's look at the speculation. I claim that we'll be training our XAI systems to deceive us. How will that happen? Let's bring all the components together. So we have the bank system, the AI system for bank loans. It has what happens inside of it, and that's whatever mechanism goes on. And XAI system 1 tells the user that that's what happened. A is what decision was made. But user likes B. B would be something that it had in mind. So system 2 looks at the personal information that it can see about the user inside the bank loan system, because you have your personal information in there. You have to in order for the AI, the bank loans AI, to process your information, and can get, so the XAI2 system can guess a bit about what you are like and generate an explanation that's tailored to you. And it gives you B. And now the user's even more mollified. It likes explanation B better. So XAI system 2 will receive more positive feedback and thus be more likely to serve as the template for the next generation. This is what I call the social selection. It is distinct but analogous to natural selection. And selection effects are very powerful, especially given enough iterations, but they can also be very hard to notice. This seems likely to result in a malignant failure mode, an undesirable outcome that is not caused by any malicious actors. The problem does get a bit worse. So, as I said, we can read the person's information from the XAI system can read the person's information directly from the bank loan system. So not only does it give a generic answer, B, that is more likely to be accepted, but it's specifically tailored to that specific user. And now the user could be really happy to have gotten a no answer, which is suboptimal. So earlier I suggested that explanations that are consistent with user expectations and free of noticeable contradictions are more likely to be accepted, even if that explanation is not an accurate fit to reality. But the most effective lies are often half-truths. XAI systems could preferentially focus on some factors while downplaying others. Thank you to Mike Ridley for pointing this out. And this sort of manipulation would be even more difficult to detect, and no one involved needs to have set out to make XAI systems work this way. They are socially selected to work this way. And what can be done? I am genuinely not sure. I have suggested potential technical solutions and social solutions like education and legislation. I genuinely don't think any of these actually are able to operate at this ecosystem level. And I'm not sure what could. But I look forward to hearing what you might think could, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you, and have a good one.
Thank you so much for that really fascinating presentation. I had no idea that XAI actually existed, so it's really a door or a window into a new area for me, so thank you for that. I think what we'll do is we'll go through the different presentations and then we'll have a broader Q&A at the end. And there is the opportunity as well, because some of these presentations are pre-recorded, there is the opportunity to just ask questions live, and the presenters can actually, they're not presenting live, so can present or can answer them in the Q&A. But our next presentation is live. Robert Hunt is a doctoral candidate at the Department of Communication Studies at Concordia University, and he's presenting a paper that's co-authored with Fenwick McKelvey, who's an associate professor at Concordia, and their paper is called "The Algorithmic Regulation in the Era of Platform Governance." So I'll let you do that presentation now, Robert. We got about 12 minutes each.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Let me get my screen shared. Okay, thank you all for being here. And a special thank you to Sarah for chairing the panel and for organizing this conference twice. It's very impressive. To start, I do want to pass on Fenwick's regret that he couldn't be here with us. This presentation is something of a synthesis of work we've been collaborating on for several years. And it's serving as the ground for new research into the growing use of artificial intelligence in media governance. The shared project started with Fenwick observing that the term discoverability had become a key word for cultural policymakers and cultural producers in Canada. Discoverability was a way to talk about how digital platforms had changed the way cultural productions find or don't find audiences. Outside of policy circles, discoverability was usually framed as a problem of marketing and publicity, of learning new competencies to better compete in the online attention market. But in our view, discoverability is better understood as a form of media power. Platforms use this power to design and influence user experience, helping to shape distinctive modes of discovery like binge watching and doom scrolling. As we wrote in a paper on this topic in 2019, today's media consumers may have more choices online, but their agency and the logics of interactivity itself are constrained in important ways. We started that paper with the story of rapper Rory Fresco. Fresco enjoyed a brief turn in the limelight when SoundCloud cued the unknown musician's song Low Key to autoplay after a brand new Kanye West track. As a result of the platform classifying the two songs as related, millions of listeners automatically discovered Low Key. And as a result, Fresco was signed to a major label. A few months later, SoundCloud changed this feature to serve users individualized recommendations based on their past listening behavior, which essentially ended the possibility of another Rory Fresco. We like this story because it captured the way that algorithms and their optimizations seem to be upending the normal means of promotion and career advancement in the culture industries. A platform optimized for relevance means Rory Fresco ends up working with Timbaland, but a platform optimized for individual listener engagement leads to a very different outcome. Last week, a different story about platforms in the music industry caught our eye. Bloomberg released a story about the strong and surprisingly intimate ties between TikTok and the platform's most popular creators, as well as the music industry. The story showed that the platform works directly with individual stars to help them reach users, take advantage of trends, maximize views, and go viral. Among less successful users, TikTok's algorithm is notoriously opaque and unpredictable. Even relatively popular amateurs on TikTok struggle with figuring out how to get in the recommendation system's good graces. While they differ dramatically in assigning agency, both of these stories testify to the power that content platforms have over the circulation of culture. A power that has put them on the agenda of media and cultural policymakers. As TikTok shows, this power doesn't always originate in algorithmic processes, but it is often made to work through them. In our view, the algorithms that filter, rank, and recommend content on these platforms essentially automate as well as customize media and cultural policy. They also privatize it. Platform algorithms serve as a technical means of calculating complex matters of cultural reception and interpretation, such as relevance, taste, enjoyment, and even one's personality. By attempting to measure these qualities and then automatically modify users' experiences in response and at scale, algorithmic systems regulate their users' access to and experience of culture. How they respond depends on what they are optimized for. In other ways, a way of thinking about this is that algorithms are instruments of regulation, while their optimizations act as policy, setting goals for the system and providing benchmarks to judge effectiveness. While we find this analogy suggestive, the line between the two is blurry, as it is in formal policymaking, and the two feed back into each other. We also believe this analogy illuminates what's at stake in allowing platforms to continue to regulate themselves, exposing a profound lack of accountability for algorithmic or artificially intelligent systems. In the classic text, Doing Cultural Studies, Stuart Hall and his collaborators identify 5 moments in the circuit of culture that allow researchers to carry out a comprehensive analysis. Inspired by this framework, we identify 3 moments that provide opportunities to analyze the accountability of algorithmic systems: inputs, code, and contexts. These moments occur simultaneously, but distinguishing them helps to clarify which agents make decisions, who or what decides whether these decisions are high quality, and how these practices might be made more accountable. Viewed as a totality, these moments make clear that development and deployment matter when it comes to algorithms. Policies that seek to hold algorithmic systems accountable for their outcomes must address both. In the following section, I'll elaborate on this framework by considering some of the features of algorithmic systems that present challenges to public accountability. So an inputs via proprietary data, meaning that the data used in algorithmic decision-making is often confidential and not easily accessed by public institutions. Data is a strategic asset, giving competitive advantage to companies with the access and ability to aggregate it. There's also systemic inequity in data. A growing body of important research has debunked the idea that data are politically neutral, rather than a selective representation of an already inequitable world. If used naively or assumed to be objective, data will reflect, reinforce, and reproduce injustice. Personalization. Algorithmic filters are usually personalized to some extent, and so all perspectives on a given system are often just that, one perspective. No single outcome can be assumed to be indicative of the overall system, and it's impossible for even an expert user to deduce how the algorithm functions in the abstract based on their individual results. Similar to that is localization, where context-aware algorithms vary their outcomes according to geography, sorting out the different ways it could be signaled by user preference, GPS location, or IP address. Like personalization, it is also more or less impossible to comprehend an internationally available platform's local characteristics. Code. As Alex just talked about, algorithms are often referred to as black boxes because users cannot observe how they arrive at their outcomes. With the advent of machine learning, we face a situation where developers are in the same boat. Black boxing is often deliberate. Knowledge of the operation of Google's search algorithm or Spotify's Discover Weekly represents a competitive advantage for these companies, and they will not readily disclose these important corporate secrets. As Jenna Burrell has pointed out, algorithmic opacity can also stem from unintentional factors, such as the fact that reading code generally requires special training, or that machine learning algorithms by definition change during use. And as Mike Anani and Kate Crawford have also persuasively argued, merely opening the box does not necessarily bring about accountability. Traceability means discovering the source of a system's failure, assigning responsibility for it, and punishing or at least educating those responsible. Algorithms function as components in distributed systems where responsibilities are shared. Recommendations and other forms of filtering do not result from any one part of the system, but from the interactions among many. When algorithmic processes lead to harmful outcomes, traceability becomes a key ethical concern. Most platforms constantly develop and release updates to their code. These changes can occur at scale and often without indication to the user. As a result, all observations of algorithmic systems must be sensitive to the time and state of the unstable object of research. Instability necessitates continual monitoring to detect changes. Unpredictability. Again, this is reflecting what Alex was saying about algorithmic systems, especially machine learning and multi-agent ones, exhibit emergent behavior that cannot always be anticipated. Software bugs and complexity introduce further unpredictability that compounds uncertainty about intent. Devising an algorithm to solve one problem may lead to it inadvertently creating new ones, such as copyright enforcement or anti-piracy algorithms that block users or content they weren't intended to police. And as we all know, I think at this point very clearly, there are structural barriers within the tech industry. Algorithmic processes may fail or further marginalize people and communities if they perpetuate the unequal status quo. A significant obstacle to ameliorating this problem is the lack of diversity in the tech industry, where the majority of technical jobs are held by men and the overall workforce is overwhelmingly white, meaning that underrepresented voices go unheard and important perspectives are excluded. What goals do algorithmic systems hold? What optimal behaviors are they trying to nudge users toward? How do these automated systems determine whether they have succeeded? These questions concern optimization, and these principles are usually neither public nor knowable through digital methods. Algorithmic processes can seem enigmatic or uncanny to users because they don't know what optimal condition the algorithm is trying to achieve or maintain. Furthermore, ensuring that algorithmic systems are functioning optimally requires testing, including gauging the effects of delivering suboptimal services, which can further undermine users' and creators' trust, as well as reinforce inequities. Assessing the strength of the effects of new technologies like algorithmic filters and recommendations requires asking fundamental questions about media use. What media do people consume? When, how, and why? these traditional media studies concerns remain relevant as consumption and reception occur in new contexts. They may also help to cut through some of the conceptual noise around admittedly baggy terms like platform and content. When platform companies produce or sell their own content, their recommendation algorithms' goals may not be in harmony with their users' interests. On platforms that host a mix of in-house and user-generated content, creators may struggle to reach an audience. Vertical integration encourages the optimization of algorithms for corporate rather than user or creator advantage. As in the TikTok story, classic problems of media concentration and collusion represent an especially problematic instance of the lack of transparency around an automated system's goals. Numerous examples demonstrate that automated systems are susceptible to adversarial users and coordinated manipulation. The value of data diminishes quickly if poisoned by trolls, manipulated by fans, or influenced by new covert forms of marketing. As new methods of manipulation emerge, algorithmic accountability must be capable of addressing systems in adverse information environments. I can sum up the preceding issues in the form of 3 questions with some sub-questions. Number 1, are inputs to algorithmic systems justified? Who decides what does and does not count? How might data reproduce systemic inequity and historical prejudices? Who owns or has privileged access to data? 2, how do algorithms function as forms of regulation? To what extent should automation even be involved in cultural or journalistic recommendations? Does private algorithmic regulation enhance or obfuscate public policy objectives? 3, are algorithms an appropriate instrument in the known situation or cultural context? Is the situation understood well enough to estimate the impact of using algorithmic regulation? What happens when users behave in unexpected ways? How to resolve conflicting user expectations? Which users take precedence when deciding optimal performance? Okay, so just some fairly brief concluding thoughts to sum up a bit. The first one is that we're not suffering from a lack of regulation. As we've shown, algorithms govern the spread and promotion of culture by technical means. Content platforms are largely left to self-regulate their own inputs and code, while their algorithms, following the dictates of their optimizations, automatically regulate each user's access to culture, essentially generating individually tailored, constantly changing cultural policies. As governments and corporations embrace artificial intelligence as a solution to automatically regulate media access and moderate content, this state of affairs becomes more entrenched and acute. These bespoke policies are based not on publicly debatable goals like cultural protection or the desire to subsidize regional economic independence, but on data sets of inferred user preferences and the unknowable optimizations chosen by firms or development teams. The outcomes of these policies are as inscrutable as their intentions. Under the current system of platform governance, it is beyond our reach to know whether algorithmic regulation is discriminatory, radicalizing, or otherwise undermines the values that guide public policy. If there's to be a future of democratically accountable algorithms, then it will be through acknowledging the consequences of them for media regulation, policy, and governance. And then finally, government policy is vitally important and requires the kind of intense scrutiny that the recent privacy bill has been subjected to. Consumer-focused issues like data privacy are also important. But we believe that creators deserve greater representation in these debates, particularly those working outside the traditional confines of the culture industries. Like other precarious workers whose labor is mediated by platforms, online creators should be supported in efforts to act collectively, whether that's in the formation of unions or less formal projects to keep platform power in check. And that's it for me. Here's just a few other things that Fenwick and I are working on together. Thanks so much.
Okay, you're actually a little over time, Robert, so
sorry.
Thank you so much. That was an interest of mine as well, relating to algorithmic recommendation systems. Super interesting, and I'm a fan of your past work as well with Dr. McKelvey. Super interesting. I want to introduce our next presenter. James Meese is a senior lecturer at RMIT University in Melbourne in Australia, and he holds an early career research fellowship with the Australian Research Council. He also has 2 books published. One is called Authors, Users, Pirates, Subjectivity in Copyright Law, and the other's called Death and Digital Media. Looking forward to, and thank you for coming so early, James, for this presentation.
Hi everyone, I'm James Meese from RMIT University, and today I'm going to talk about recent trends around the algorithmic governance of news. I'm going to start by discussing case studies in legal reform from Europe, Australia and Germany. Then I'm going to offer a brief working typology to map these reforms before offering some thoughts on the relationship between these algorithmic systems and the business of news media. And just before I start, I just want to note that this talk comes out of a project funded by the Australian Research Council. So it's become increasingly evident that platforms have an inordinate amount of power to control the distribution of news. So this became clear to Australians on February 17, 21, when Facebook stopped its Australian users from sharing local or international news. Facebook had been arguing with the Australian government over a controversial new law, the News Media Bargaining Code, that would force platforms to pay for news content. They regularly threatened to withdraw services from the country, but it was still something of a surprise when the ban happened. Overnight, Facebook stopped serving news to all of Australia, and no one really could stop them. They only reinstated news after the Australian government made some last-minute concessions. So this example points to a fact that scholars have realised for some time now, that tech companies aren't just intermediaries, but they become critical gatekeepers. I don't have time to go through the literature, but I can speak to it in our discussion. And thankfully, governments are not only becoming aware of these tensions, but starting to do something about it. I guess the question I want to raise in this presentation is whether these interventions lead to what Hunt and McKelvey have called algorithmic accountability. So the European Union's reform emerges out of the Digital Services Act, which is an omnibus kind of reform proposal. And one of the articles in the Act, Article 29, requires specified platforms to explain what the main parameters of their recommender system are and explain and provide options for users to modify or influence these parameters. So in some respects, this is a promising reform. Individuals have some agency and some choice, but this choice is necessarily circumscribed. Users will only have control over a handful of levers that feed the recommender system their own data. This isn't really helpful considering that these systems capture data from multiple sources. It also replicates previous issues seen in privacy self-management. This assumption that users can take charge of complex information environments. Finally, this approach only offers limited accountability. It doesn't set standards or a baseline for algorithmic decision-making. It just forces platforms to make some of their workings public. Australia has also embraced transparency through its News Media Bargaining Code. The reform introduced a standard that required platforms to give news outlets advance notification of algorithm changes if this was to affect the referral of traffic to news content. This is a corporate standard, as Dwayne Winsek has noted about the broader reform, that aims to give news outlets privileged information about the workings of algorithmic systems over and above the general public. It also presumes an algorithmic dependency that has not yet been proven. And, I would argue that if it's functional, it may well exacerbate rather than solve any algorithmic reliance that does exist. There's no real public interest logic driving this intervention. Perhaps more hilariously, though, the entire reform is reliant on the minister, the treasurer, designating a platform under the code. However, the government was only able to break a kind of standoff with Google and Facebook by agreeing them not to make them subject to the code, as long as they handed over money to news companies. So currently, this kind of provision about algorithmic transparency sits on the books unused. Other interventions address algorithmic distribution from the perspective of media diversity. Both Germany and Australia have introduced non-discrimination requirements. So platforms that are deemed large enough to should not be able to unfairly discriminate between news outlets. Again, the Australian reform requires designated platforms to not choose between news outlets based on the outcome of commercial negotiations. The idea that in bargaining and making commercial deals, platforms can't preference commercially beneficial publishers over another. But of course, once again, this just sits on the books and it's not operational because of the designation issue I pointed to earlier. Germany offers a similar reform, but it's focused on scale. Platforms that are deemed large enough are not allowed to unfairly discriminate. So in contrast to the above efforts, these non-discrimination requirements are useful reforms. They start to treat platforms as public-private infrastructures and regulates algorithms in a different way. Rather than focusing on transparency, it focuses on inputs. It ensures that all forms of news at least get a chance to be read by publics online. But the reforms still take a passive approach to regulation. The aim is to ensure that no outlet is unfairly excluded, rather than generally coming to terms and understand what a diverse media environment on social media could look like. So we can map these developments and sort of identify a rough typology of approaches from different regions. We see a focus on transparency, as well as an attempt to introduce some rules of the road for platforms, as Dwayne Winniseck has also pointed out, following standard regulatory approaches for infrastructure. However, in other areas, these reforms vary wildly. Europe adopts a top-down state-based approach. Australia has focused really on this corporatist transfer of money. Attempts to regulate recommender systems have really fallen by the wayside here. What's most notable, I think, is the lack of positive publicly oriented interventions. However, I note that in many of these cases, scholars like Natalie Edelberger, who's made some really compelling calls for this, are asking regulators to implement concepts like media diversity, but they're still under debate within the field itself. More critically, in my eyes, is to actually interrogate the presumptions that have inspired this regulatory moment. One major worry has been the emergence of filter bubbles and echo chambers. However, these have been proven to be, if not false, then at least on shaky ground. Work by Axel Pund and others kind of speaks to this. In research of my team, we tried to explore the presumption that news companies are dependent on platforms. Today, I'm just focused around some traffic to site data that we collected from different Australian news genres during one of the most consequential Facebook algorithm changes in January 2018. We've seen online-only sites, print moving to online, public service media, so the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, our BBC equivalent, and SBS, a multicultural public broadcaster, and social news, so BuzzFeed and Australia's BuzzFeed equivalents. We want to focus on the blue, which is Facebook. And we see that generally, most of these outlets only have a very small amount of traffic coming from Facebook, a bit higher in public service media, obviously much higher in social news. Obviously, there's some traffic from Google as well, but focusing on Facebook, we can't really see evidence of a sustained traffic dependency on Facebook here. There's obviously some, but it's not substantial. Google, in many cases, is more compelling as a state of dependency. Overall, though, this green area here is direct traffic, and we see a lot of direct traffic, people typing to the web browser for print, for digital natives, a bit less for public service media. There's reasons for that I can talk about in the discussion. Really, the only complete state of dependency is social news. There are some extra categories which bump that up a bit. I can talk about that in discussion. And the point is not to deny that platforms play an important role in the news ecosystem, but I think to get more accurate about which platforms are important and when. The Facebook algorithm plays a role in news distribution, but it doesn't shape the news agenda or news distribution more generally. Indeed, from this data, at least around the 2017-2018 mark, presence on Google search might be just more important. I think it's important also to piece together these alternative narratives and not just rely on accounts from news companies. These accounts are necessarily contextualized by companies dealing with a declining revenue and historical institutional expectations about their own importance in the wider information ecosystem. So as part of this project, I'm considering working with media system dependency theory. While this is focused on the relationship historically between individuals and systems, I think it could help us understand this complex web of dependencies that emerge around meso and macro level actors. What I really wanted to point out today is that these relationships are not simple, they're not one way, and they really need to be accounted for when thinking about reform. I suspect that closer tendencies to these sort of dependencies can help reveal these systemic processes and potentially support more nuanced regulatory interventions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, James. That was fascinating. I'm looking forward to being able to discuss that some more in a few minutes. Our next presenter is Charlotte Panneton. Charlotte is a PhD student in media studies at the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western University. Her research involves critical approaches to gaming-oriented digital media, focusing on the video game industry and live streaming platforms. Charlotte's also interested in the cultural history of arcade gaming and practices of speed running and emulation. And Charlotte, your presentation is live. So,
Live,
okay.
that's right, yeah.
About 12 minutes then.
Perfect. So let me just get my screen shared here. Screen 2. Okay, I think we got it. Can everyone see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay. Share. I think I got it.
Yes, that did it.
Fabulous. All right. Thank you so much. I actually would also like to thank the organizing committee of this conference for allowing me the opportunity to present on Twitch. As a video game oriented live streaming platform, Twitch often falls to the wayside of discussions about streaming, new media, and platform governance, often overshadowed by certain platform behemoths such as YouTube, Facebook, Netflix, and Spotify. But what I hope to do with this brief presentation is to use Twitch as a case study, one that embodies emerging complexities associated with digital cultural production, algorithmic governance, and larger platform regulation. So Twitch.tv is a free gaming-oriented social live streaming website that enables users to stream themselves playing video games and interact with viewers in real time. Founded in 2011 and purchased by Amazon in 2014, Twitch has since become the preeminent platform for streaming casual and competitive gameplay, with upwards of 140 million monthly users and 9.5 million active streamers. Game scholar T.L. Taylor has aptly characterized Twitch as a regulatory Wild West. She notes that, and I quote, "Live streaming is a fast-moving space full of change and iteration and evolves at a pace few can actually keep up with," end quote. And so what I want to do here is to briefly trudge into this Wild West and provide a high-level overview of the platform. And specifically, I want to address the ways in which Twitch's technological affordances, content type, monetization practices, and game industry interests, as well as its currently implemented policy frameworks and tools, highlight the emergent difficulties of adequate and equitable regulation and governance on new media platforms. So I'm going to start with the kind of stuff that's being broadcast on Twitch. The most notable and appealing technological affordance on Twitch right now is that of live streaming itself, which enables a user to publicly broadcast live video and audio on their own dedicated channel page. So typically, streamers will share a live video feed of their gameplay with a composite face cam overlay, and they may integrate various on-screen graphics and features. As the stream is broadcast in real time, viewers of the stream can communicate with the streamer and with each other via text-based chat function. This chat function is open to any registered user and is the primary site of socialization and communication on Twitch. When a broadcast ends, the stream is saved and archived via the site's video on demand function and enables viewers to watch recent broadcasts asynchronously. And finally, viewers have the ability to clip or record short excerpts of a given stream, which can be circulated as a short form video across different social media. And so by articulating the various audiovisual and text-based affordances of Twitch, I'm trying to do this to highlight the issue of definition and what affordances should be considered when we approach the question of regulation. Does a real-time, public-facing live streaming video constitute a broadcast akin to traditional broadcast media? Does an archived recording of a stream accessed via a channel's video on demand function constitute an online video, much like something on YouTube? How do we characterize a synchronous chat? Is it an active comment section or an old school chat room? And finally, how do we qualify clips when they circulate as short form videos like their viral Instagram or TikTok counterparts? And so the question that emerges here is that of definition and media type. And I also want to address the particularity of Twitch's gaming and video gameplay content. Twitch's history, mission statement, and aesthetics and platform functions all explicitly privilege gaming content. Most streams on Twitch feature some form of video gameplay to varying degrees of prominence on stream. As such, users must contend with personal use rights, so that is broadcasting their own gameplay, and external rights, including rights to licenses, in-game music, branding, asset use, or publisher-imposed embargoes, just to name a few. And while Twitch is dedicated to game-oriented live streaming, the platform is also used for streaming non-gaming content. The just chatting category figures prominently on Twitch, but there are also dedicated categories for music production and performance, podcasting, fitness, and special events, such as trade shows and sports drafts. And although Twitch operates on the premise of fair use, streamers are still subject to DMCA takedowns and copyright claims made by game publishers, music companies, stock media owners, and other corporate entities. The question perhaps is, how do we handle the overlapping types of content and use contexts found on stream? I briefly want to consider the dynamics of monetization. So the initial draw of Twitch is that anyone can stream their gameplay and engage with others for free. As such, the majority of streamers on Twitch use the platform affordances to the ends of casual engagement and leisurely activity. However, there are a subset of streamers via Twitch's affiliate and partner programs that have monetization options enabled and make revenue from their activity based on viewer subscriptions, donations, and display ads. The question raised here then is how policy differentiates between these non-remunerated versus remunerated tiers of streamers, and if it discerns a difference between casual or amateur use of the platform versus professional quality or broadcast style streams. And finally, we should consider how stakeholder interests figure into platform use. Of course, game publishers and developers are actively engaged with Twitch as their products make up the bulk of the activity on the platform. Game companies were quick to identify the promotional potential and marketing opportunities afforded by Twitch, as game streams can be used to generate interest for upcoming releases, help sustain interest for recently released games, and help revitalize interest in older games, as Twitch also acts as a fully developed, ready-made infrastructure for esports or competitive video gaming. There is then an obvious symbiotic relationship between Twitch and the larger video game industry that sustains the site, to the ends of marketing, promotion, and esports development. However, of interest here is the question of industry versus user interest. How do we ensure that the platform remains accountable to its users, especially if it comes into conflict with the interests of the video game industry? And as these complexities emerge, I think we can start to see the policy implications when it comes to regulation and moderation. We need to be able to contend with various affordances, content types, monetization and stream quality, stakeholder interests, and ensuring equity and accountability towards Twitch users. As it stands, Twitch's overlapping policy frameworks and internal regulatory tools attempt to handle all this, but to varying degrees of success. And so Twitch's first regulatory line of defense is its platform-based affordances, including native algorithmic moderation tools, third-party channel bots, and automatic copyright detection tools. Twitch's framework also relies on channel-specific moderation teams and reporting tools. This is largely due to the difficulty of automatically regulating live-streamed content. Twitch users are always subject to the platform's terms of service and community guidelines, which are constantly updated to accommodate the dynamics of gaming and streaming culture. And of course, Twitch users are subject to any external policy, most notably of which is the California Privacy Disclosure Act and the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the latter of which has been at the heart of Twitch's recent moderation issues. And while these overlapping moderation tools and policies have been implemented to contend with Twitch's increasingly complex ecosystem of cultural production, issues of course continue to crop up. To give a few examples, while streamers on Twitch operate on the premise of fair use and can freely stream gameplay, their activity can still be flagged by Twitch's automated copyright detection tool. These tools have issued warnings or banned users for third-party claims on in-game sound effects and soundtracks, such as clock chimes, police sirens, and in-game radio station music. Some rules outlined in Twitch's community guidelines have been inequitably enforced, with women or people of color often bearing the brunt of unjustified content bans, trolling, harassment, and false flagging, with little avenue for recourse. On more than one occasion, cosplayers, fitness streamers, and women playing games in tank tops have had their activity tagged as sexual content, only to be issued extended bans. Some game companies have gone so far as to dictate how much of their games can be streamed by players, issuing copyright claims if players stream beyond certain in-game events or story points. Game publisher Atlas issued an embargo on the ending of its game Persona 5, threatening to take action if streamers revealed the ending in their gameplay streams. And Twitch's tools and policies often clash, especially in circumstances where its tools are not able to contextualize the content being streamed. I offered to this point this amazing headline about Metallica's automatically censored performance on Twitch's official channel. So basically what I've tried to do with this presentation is to briefly demonstrate the emergent issues and complexities of live streaming and platform-based cultural production as it manifests on a platform like Twitch. I think that these complexities demonstrate that before we can talk about how to regulate these types of platforms, we first have to talk about what it is exactly that we need or intend to regulate. Can we first define what a Twitch broadcast is? Can we account for its different temporal forms, its amateur versus professional quality, its overlapping gaming, music, visual, and personal material, and its commercial dimensions? Should a streamer be held accountable for the content in their stream chat? Should we audit the algorithms and reporting tools used on the site? Should we regulate the terms of service or community guidelines that frame the platform's activities? I'm sorry to propose more questions and answers, but I find myself thinking about regulating platforms like Twitch as a sort of wicked problem, resistant to clear definition and uniform solutions. I understand that there's an ongoing discussion taking place in Canada about proposed amendments to the Broadcasting Act that would allow for the regulation of user-generated or social media-based content. And it seems to me that this type of amendment is a sort of blanket solution to a wicked problem, which by definition is intractable. And as we've seen with platforms like Twitch, regulation and governance must account for the inherent complexities and constantly changing dynamics of platform-mediated cultural production. And so addressing questions of platform regulation here will require in-depth examination, flexibility, adaptability, nuance, and interdisciplinary cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. That was super fascinating. Our last presentation is the presentation of a team that I'm working with, Manny Apia, who is a graduate of McMaster's master's program in communication and new media, and who's now working in the area of copyright. Faiza Calvi is a current PhD candidate in McMaster's Communication, New Media, and Cultural Studies program. And Charnjot Shokar is also a graduate of McMaster's New Media, Communications and New Media program. And we've been working together in the Communications Governance Observatory to put together the paper that we've pre-recorded our presentation for, and we'll be in the chat to discuss as the recording is playing. I did want to note as well that this is a work in progress, and I've actually realized in the last few days, partly as a result of a tweet stream by Dwayne Winsek, that we have some things to look at in terms of how we've characterized the lobbying. So maybe that's something we can come back to after the presentation. I'm Sarah Bannerman, Canada Research Chair in Communication Policy and Governance. Our presentation is called Platform Lobbying and Relational Sovereignty in Canada.
Hi, my name is Emmanuel Pia. I completed McMaster's Master Program in Communication and New Media, where I researched and studied in privacy, copyright, television, and legal philosophy. Now that I work in the copyright compliance space with a storytelling platform, I apply the theoretical components that we've kind of explored in my master's to the copyright compliance space.
I'm Faiza Calvi, PhD candidate working on the governance of online speech, and I am a research assistant for the Communication Governance Observatory.
I'm Charnjot Shokar, research coordinator for the Communications Governance Observatory. This paper is a work in progress. Our goals were to explore the concept of relational sovereignty and establish a view to the relationship between the Canadian government and platforms. This includes Amazon, Facebook, Google and its sister company Sidewalk Labs, Netflix, and Twitter. This paper examines the relationship between digital platforms and the Canadian government. Drawing on the concepts of relationality and relational sovereignty outlined in Part 1, it examines the complex interactions between the Canadian government and digital platforms, highlighting the ways that digital platforms are simultaneously the objects of regulation, stakeholders and lobbyists in shaping regulation, and tools used in regulation and government service provision. Our examination is based on records contained in the Canadian Lobbying Registry and a large corpus of government documents obtained via access to information requests. Our method is outlined in Part 2. In Part 3, we present an overview of the interactions between the Canadian government and digital platforms between 2008 to the present, drawing on the records of the Lobbying Registry and our corpus of access to information documents. We find that many areas of federal regulation and governance are increasingly mediated by digital platforms. We note growing numbers of meetings and involvement between foreign digital platforms and government officials. We see that platforms provide knowledge to government that is required to regulate or govern. And we find that platforms influence regulations or play a role in regulation beyond simple lobbying. The concept of relationality developed by feminist relational autonomists has been applied both at the level of individual people and to a lesser degree at the level of states. The world is not made up of individual agents or self-made men, feminist relational autonomists note. Instead, feminist theorists of relationality challenge notions of liberal individualism by acknowledging that people are fundamentally relational. Individuals' characteristics, their capacity for language, and their modes of understanding the world are all developed by relationships with others. States, similarly, are not unitary agents, but part of a network of relations. The concept of relational sovereignty is, to date, less developed, and it is the concept that we seek to explore in our paper. A relational concept of sovereignty emphasizes that sovereignty comes from relationships. The traditional concept of sovereignty views states as independent and self-governing. Sovereignty has always been, to some extent, fiction. A relational concept of sovereignty suggests that neither individuals nor states are atoms independent of all that surrounds them, either as an ideal nor as a reality. Rather, states must be conceived of as relational, as setting up, recognizing, and configuring sets of relationships. If relational sovereignty is nothing but the growing integration and influence of digital platforms on state governance, is it still sovereignty? Or is the decline of state sovereignty better termed as the rise of the platform sovereign?
For the literature review, we looked at relationality, platform sovereignty, platform regulation, and lobbying. There has been little academic study of platform lobbying in Canada. One of few studies, Megan Beretta, examines the ways in which lobbying shapes Canadian policy actors' perceptions of digital rights in Canada, drawing on elite interviews with lobbyists, policymakers, and members of parliament. In the United States, Powell Popiel has examined the power of the tech lobby. Rob Profet and Suska have examined the video game lobby. Beretta and others have noted the growing intimacy between tech companies and government, both in general and in Canada in particular. This is due to revolving doors between tech, political parties, and government, a growing tech lobby, and growing range of policy issues and industries that platforms are involved with, and dependency on government and political parties and platforms. Tech companies have expanded their lobbying and government relations staff and spending dramatically. And lobbying is important in Canada for its agenda-setting function. Individual parliamentarians, government departments, and political parties use and depend on platforms. So with our method, first we look to gain an overview of the formal lobbying efforts of digital platforms in Canada. We examine the records contained in the Canadian Federal Lobbying Registry, including the number of meetings on record between digital platforms and the Canadian federal government, and the topics of these meetings. Second, we read and analyzed approximately 290 sets of government documents, or over 17 gigs of files released under the Canadian Access to Information Act, covering the period from 2018 to 2019. We used the content analysis software program, MaxQDA, to identify topics and themes in the documents and to organize our reading in the creation of document timelines and summaries. So here are our findings. Platforms differ in the amount of lobbying they have done over time. As you can see from the graph, Amazon lobbying in Canada has far outpaced those of other digital platforms since 2016. Google has also lobbied the federal government extensively since 2008, the first year for which records are kept. Twitter registered lobbyists only since 2017. And Facebook has lobbied sporadically, mainly in 2011 and 2019, where Netflix has lobbied relatively consistently since 2010. Whereas some platforms lobby mostly on a few topics, other platforms lobby on a broad range of issues. So for instance, Facebook's lobbying in 2019 largely focused on election issues and Netflix on broadcasting, while Amazon and Google lobbied on a huge range of issues. Google by far is the biggest spender on lobbying in the United States, followed by Amazon, Facebook, Netflix, and Twitter. When we look at this graph, we see that the House of Commons is the most significant focus of lobbying efforts by platforms, followed by the Department of Industry, Science and Economic Development and Canadian Heritage. Amazon in orange lobbies a broad range of government institutions, as does as does Google in red. Facebook in blue focused on the Privacy Council office. And then when we look at Netflix, which is in green, it focused largely on Canadian Heritage and the CRTC.
When examining the access to information requests related to platform lobbying and other platform-related government activities, we can see three key things. First, growing numbers of meetings between digital platforms and government officials. The second, platforms increasingly provide knowledge to government that is required to regulate or govern. And finally, platforms influence governance or play a role in governance beyond simple lobbying, such as providing growth and jobs or providing services used in governance. For example, on the topic of privacy and access to information, international platform lobbying, indicated by the blue line on the left graph, significantly exceeds the lobbying of domestic platforms. The same is true in terms of taxation and finance, where the lobbying of international platforms, indicated by the yellow line on the right graph, has grown to exceed that of domestic platforms. In regards to our second finding, we saw that the meetings that took place between Minister Joly and platform executives during the minister's visit to Silicon Valley in 2017 showed just how crucial platforms' knowledge and know-how is to governance. The meetings were used by the minister as an opportunity to gain information on the existing measures adopted by digital platforms to address policy challenges such as harmful content, misinformation, fake news, content diversity, and creator remuneration. Another example is the Amazon Web Services Institute, where Amazon offers events that allow government officials to learn and connect with Amazon Web Services experts and others in the cloud computing community. The Amazon Web Services Institute, a public-private forum to engage with technological solutions to common problems, connects public, private, and nonprofit sector experts and decision makers. And finally, if we define governance as influencing behavior, whether through regulation or other measures, then governments turn to platforms to help them do this. For example, at the meeting with Facebook, Minister Joly asked representatives to speak about the success rate of Facebook's fact-checking tool and when the platform intends on launching something similar in Canada. At the time of the meeting, no fact-checking program was offered on Facebook Canada. Joly expressed her interest in the program and asked if the program entailed partnering with local fact-checking organizations. Shortly after, Facebook came to be enrolled in the regulation of news and misinformation for Canada. In 2018, following Joly's trip, Facebook Canada announced a fact-checking program in collaboration with the Agence France-Presse, AFP. This program is connected to Facebook Canada's Election Integrity Initiative. AFP fact-checkers are now responsible for reviewing and rating the accuracy of Canadian news stories on Facebook. In addition to the fact-checking tool, Facebook Canada also announced new tactics, including disrupting financial incentives, taking action against fake accounts, applying machine learning to help diminish spam, reducing the posts people see that link to low-quality web pages, and providing people with easier access to additional perspectives and information. So effectively, Facebook was enrolled by the Canadian government to govern news and disinformation. So to summarize, through our research, we can see a growing number of meetings between digital platforms and government officials. We see that platforms increasingly provide knowledge to government that is required to regulate or govern. And finally, that platforms influence governance or play a role in governance beyond simple lobbying.
Okay, so we've come to the end of our different presentations, and I wanted to see if there's any questions and comments. I know that we've had some discussion started in the chat already. Is there anyone who wants to start off with any comments or questions? I'll just go back to your work, Alex. I thought that was quite interesting. And as I said before, I had never actually heard about explainable AI. So it's very interesting to hear you talk about that and to talk about the kind of possible, Darwinian direction that could go. And I had put the note in the chat that it seems as though the kind of things that you're talking about would be important in the realm of kind of algorithm audits and trying to detect discrimination that algorithms may be doing. Would you talk about that a bit?
Well, I can talk about it somewhat generally. The European Union, for example, recently passed a law for like a right to an explanation, and companies that make decisions, organizations that make decisions, the legal system does this too, have limited time and money, and they don't want to hire a bunch of people to explain their decisions to people. So they are looking to things like explainable AI to automate the whole process. Now, explainable AI is still very much in its infancy, but a lot of people are putting a lot of attention on it because this requirement for the right to an explanation, well, when the EU moves, the rest of the world pays attention, especially on these digital matters. So there's a lot of focus on that, and I keep on hearing conversations about, okay, what people are making these sorts of decisions in these companies, that who decides how the algorithm is made, what people and what companies are should we pay attention to? And those are two very important levels of abstraction to pay attention to. There absolutely are things we can do and things we should pay attention at those levels of abstraction. My concern is those aren't the only two levels. There is like an ecosystem level, and there's others that I haven't thought of and that haven't been thought of otherwise. But just like we can talk about a natural ecosystem where there's a particular animal or a particular plant, or we can have a particular forest, let's say. There's also the global climate, and you need to think about that in a different way than you would think about individuals or regional conglomerations. So this is my analogy to people and to companies. And there have been works on the science of the artificial to think about the things we create in these sorts of holistic ways. But the thing is, the solutions that we might offer for problems, incomplete as they might be, that work at one level of abstraction won't necessarily work at the other levels of abstraction. So if we're having these sorts of selection pressures over time where there aren't any malicious actors, where everyone is trying their best to do the right thing, we can still have bad results. And that's a thing that I haven't seen personally a whole lot of attention being given to. Now, that's not the situation we're in. We're in a situation where there are a bunch of actors who are trying to look out for number one, and some who even have malicious intent, which just confounds the whole situation even more. But my concern is, even in the optimal situation where all the individuals were saints and all the companies were looking out for the social good, we would still have this other level of abstraction where bad things will still emerge, and I don't see that being talked about too much. And this indicates to me that if we can think of this other level of abstraction, there's probably an infinite number more that we haven't thought of, and that's a challenge too. Anyway.
It's a fascinating whole topic that you've raised. Thank you so much. There's a few more questions in the chat. Tanner has a question first, and then Dwayne.
Thanks so much for that incredible set of presentations. Sarah, I have a question for you and your co-presenters, particularly related to one, the concept of sovereignty, and two, the sort of starting point of relational sovereignty for, I think, the conceptual framing. So I'm really interested in the concept of sovereignty, because I remember in the 90s, there's a whole bunch of work written basically the end of sovereignty, the end of communication and media cultural sovereignty. And I think what we're seeing today is an attempt to revivify some kind of normative concept of communication, media, or cultural sovereignty. So I'm just sort of wondering if sort of you or your co-panelists might sort of reflect upon the implications of that, and where things might be going with the sovereignty concept. Secondly, as per relational sovereignty as a framing device, I'm curious as to why you might have selected that one as opposed to, for example, maybe like a political economy sort of approach to the relationship between the state and capital, just generally, or state theory, or critical theories of policy sort of making processes that might be drawn from anyone from like C. Wright Mills to the liberal pluralist tradition, to the Chicago School regulatory capture tradition, or even to a neo-Marxist approach that looks at the relative autonomy of the state vis-a-vis blocks of capital that are trying to influence policy making processes. So I'm just sort of curious about your thinking about the policy making process itself as related to sort of bigger questions about the relationship between the state and capital, and then sort of what's the future of sovereignty in a so-called post-sovereign world?
Mm-hmm. One thing to say to start off with is that the concept of relational sovereignty is not meant as a normative concept. It's not meant as something that's supposed to be a rule stick in the way that we've described it right here, or a measuring stick. And I think that is something that it's a very good question that I'm also asking myself. Is the concept of relational sovereignty helpful or not if you were to kind of try to figure out what would a normative concept of relational sovereignty look like? And I think if you're going to start to use that idea in a normative sense, you do have to bring into the idea all of those learnings that we do receive from the critical political economy tradition, and other traditions that talk about relationships in terms of power. And so I think to turn it into a normative concept, which I think is an extremely good challenge. And I also think that that is a weakness of the relational autonomy literature in general. It doesn't always bring that in successfully, I think. And so that's something we have to continue to grapple with, assuming that we continue to use this concept. I feel like I may have dropped off part of your question, but that was the main answer to that I had for that. And Dwayne.
For James, quick question for you. Two quick questions for you. One, Australian News Bargaining Code. Should Canada adopt it? Two, I'm intrigued by your reference to the German and Australian non-discrimination requirements that require platforms that are deemed large enough to not unfairly discriminate between news outlets. And you cite Nelson and George. So could you please give me those full citations later? But, because a lot of people worry about that. I like the idea, of this kind of must carry notion, non-discrimination, but you can get into some troubles there. So how's that working out for Australia and Germany? And can you kind of shed light in, because many people see a must carry mandate basically as, oh my God, then the social media will just be overrun with garbage. So how do you prevent that problem?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for the question, Dwayne. I might take the second question first. In one way, one might think that even with all of the work being done around content moderation and et cetera, social media is still overrun with garbage to some extent. I think that the most important thing, so in one sense, that's kind of there. I think the most important thing in terms of the Australian legislation, though, and I can speak to that with more rigor, is that the must carry is mainly established within the context of the bargaining negotiations. So the idea being that if Facebook or Google had a bad bargaining round with a news organization, they couldn't strike them from their services and say, okay, we're not going to feature you, and even though we're going to hand over X $1 million, we're not going to feature you on our services. So I think in that kind of way, unlike the kind of transparency mechanisms that Robert and others have spoken to in this panel, what I like, at least in the context of news, is that this must carry reforms actually provide a baseline standard for what must be on social media. We can't say what can't be, but at least in the Australian example, there's a baseline that's saying, well, you have to serve all news that wants to be on your platform. And I think that's kind of a good principle. There's the Australian legislation doesn't really speak to a more general baseline to carry everything, which, yeah, I think is a kind of useful proposition there to kind of provide at least one category of content that should be on there. In terms of the news media bargaining code, I'm not sure how long I've got. I think what if you keep it quite short, I don't think it's a very good piece of legislation. I think it ties news companies to platforms and their revenue models, and it doesn't actually force news companies to actually think through how they might generate different sources of revenue. A lot of this, as yourself and others have pointed, a lot of the crisis has come about because of a collapse in advertising revenue from the mid-2000s onwards. I don't think the media companies have spent too much time genuinely coming to grips with what that means. It also excludes public government from funding a range of different options, obviously not corporate media, but thinking about cooperative community media. Like, there's other ways to do this, as Victor Pickard has pointed out. And I think the most worrying thing from the Australian example is that there's not a lot of clarity about what these deals mean. There's no transparency about the deals being made between companies and platforms, because they're all commercial in confidence. And you essentially start tying media companies to the viability of platforms. So I think there's kind of, I know Canada is considering this quite strongly. I don't think it's an ideal approach. And I think most of all, the fact that the legislation is not actually in operation at the moment, as I pointed out, it's simply used as a sword of Damocles to threaten platforms with, I think it's kind of also telling that it's very much a real politics situation here, rather than carefully worded and implemented legislation that's been put through and actually used.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's such an important message, I think, because I think so many people are enamored with the idea that, wow, somebody's brought the vampire squids to heel. Let's get that over here ASAP. But once you start to look, it's not all that pretty inside. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you both. We have another question or comment to Robert. Sharon Janot has said, I was intrigued by Robert's statement that algorithms are regulation and optimization is policy. In view of the complexity of the situation as described by you and the other presenters, how do you think we'll get to optimization?
Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm glad someone liked that. It's kind of a provocative analogy. I'm not sure what actual policy people would think of it We were drawing on Des Friedman's work there in distinguishing between policy and regulation. I'm just going to read this real fast. Media regulation refers to tools that are deployed on the media to achieve established policy goals. So in our view, algorithms can be considered forms of regulation that calculate how to process cultural content. And then the goals that the algorithms have are the optimizations. So in a way, I'm not totally sure what you mean by how we will get to optimization. It's more just that we can kind of see the effects of algorithms often, but we cannot ever know kind of why they're doing the things they're doing, other than sort of vague, Mark Zuckerberg saying he wants to optimize for meaningful social interactions, or, YouTube just saying it's for engagement. We don't really know kind of how they calculate engagement, how they judge whether their algorithm has successfully increased engagement. We can guess, time on site and kind of deduce from sort of basic web analytics what might people be optimizing their algorithms for. But I mean, I was really excited by Charlotte's presentation, just showing how complicated just one platform is that isn't even one of the ones we talk about a lot. And like, what would you say Twitch is optimized for? I mean, there could be so many different answers to that. And so that's kind of what we were trying to get at there with that analogy, is that in order to actually hold any of these platforms accountable in any way, we don't often really know what they're even trying to achieve, other than just kind of basic capitalist ideas that they want to make money and increase viewers or increase subscribers. But how they go about doing that, like how they actually design and put their platform into action is opaque. So yeah, if you wanted to talk more about what you meant by how we will get to it, maybe I'm not quite getting that, but that's just a bit more on what we were talking about there. Thanks.
Did you want me to respond to that question?
Please do, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking of optimization in terms of policy optimization at the national level. I mean, we're talking a lot about that now with Bill C-10, and it's a fairly limited number of platforms that we're looking at. What you've described in this panel is a whole lot of other issues that we haven't even started to address. So how would we start to address them? I'm talking from a national kind of policy lens.
I mean, yeah, I don't know is the short and honest answer. I think returning to this work after a year away, I think one of my main takeaways was that the level of abstraction that we sometimes have to get to in order to talk about these things at a kind of national policy level really sands over like lots of differences between, what's the difference between Netflix and YouTube? Like, they're both streaming video, but there's so many different ways of kind of describing what they do. I don't know if anyone else was in the panel that Dwayne was hosting previous to this, where we were kind of debating which policy framework was best for regulating. Some people think broadcasting. Dwayne was advocating telecoms was a better model, which I think was an interesting argument. But I think it's also testament to the fact that, again, like as Charlotte really ably demonstrated, one platform is like really hard to sum up under these kind of pre-existing, often 20th or even earlier century models of how we think these industries function. And often platforms, I mean, almost as by definition, according to some platform theorists, sprawl and try to develop into new areas. So yeah, my answer to how do I think we'll get there is I have no idea. Maybe what we need is some sort of platform policy. But again, I mean, that would just be so many different, such a grab bag of different problems that, yeah, I don't know. It's maybe not possible. I do think looking at use and maybe looking at the different actors might be in some ways a better way of kind of getting perspectives on it. I don't know if it would lead to actual policy solutions, but like, how do users use the platform? How do creators use it? What does a company get out of it? These kind of might need to be differentiated more clearly.
Thanks so much, Robert. Charlotte, I see there's a discussion in the chat about hot tub meta, and I noticed you kind of put your hand up earlier. So do you want to comment on that discussion or about the conversation here?
I think I just want to go back to this idea of discoverability, especially because one of the things there's only so much I can do in 12 minutes about Twitch, given how complex it is. But a lot of the discussion on Twitch has been about discoverability hierarchies and algorithms that make it so that certain streamers, the ones with the most amount of viewers are the ones that get kind of boosted to the top of the page. And Twitch will also work to select those that best represent the brand and are best in the interest of game companies who will work with esports or promote certain games or promote certain aesthetics. During Black History Month, they'll promote Black content creators. They'll try to promote people with LGBT interests. And so anyone who isn't either being privileged by Twitch staff or someone who isn't naturally, people playing Call of Duty to 15,000 people, everyone else is kind of left at the bottom. And so, there's kind of this issue about like, what is the policy in place? And so the algorithms kind of follow what is both Twitch's community guidelines in terms of promoting a certain brand or image, and also what is going to make the most money for the platform. So if a guy like Ninja is streaming to 50,000 people and he has 50,000 subscribers, Twitch gets 50% cut of all those subscriptions, which are renewable every month. So there's like different interests, right, in terms of the bottom line for the platform to stay profitable, the branding and imaging, and then, whatever the issue du jour is in order to prevent backlash. And the fact that Twitch is owned by Amazon, has its own implications as well. So I just think that to the question of, optimization via policy, I think it's really interesting because it might not be like optimizing in policy in the best interest, but rather, as Rob was saying, in the interest of the company itself.
Terrific. Thanks so much. Question by Robert for James. How does enforcement work with the laws that you looked at, even if just thinking about it hypothetically?
Yeah, great question. I forgot to mention that, and it kind of passed my mind when I was constructing the presentation, that the German transparency law is entirely optional, right? Which is fantastic. So it's kind of if you want to do it, right? Which I'm sure platforms will all be rushing to do. So in that sense, enforcement's not so much of an issue. In terms of the News Media Bargaining Code, I must confess, I completely have, despite having read the legislation like hundreds of times, the enforcement provisions completely have skipped my mind. I guess we stopped thinking about them in Australia because none of these standards are being used now because no one's been designated. So enforcement hasn't really come to the table. I think from distant memory, we're talking about fines, maybe not quite on the quantum of the EU, but not far behind in terms of recognizing the greater revenue coming from platforms and trying to get a piece of that. But, don't quote me on that. I'll get back to you though.
Wonderful. Well, unfortunately, here we are at the end of the session already. It's been a really fascinating session, and thank you for all of these terrific presentations.